हो इल्म से मुहकम तो गैरत जिब्राईल, अगर हो इश्क से मुहकम तो सूर इसराफील। अज़ाब दानिश हाजिर से बाखबर हूँ मैं कि मैं साग में डाला गया हूँ मिस्ल खलील। फरेब खुर्द मंजिल है कारवां वरना ज़ियादा राहत मंजिल से है निशात रही। नजर नहीं तो मेरे हल्क़ाए सुखन में न बैठ कि नुक्तहाए खुदी हैं मिसाल तेग़ असील। मुझे वो दर्स फरंग आज याद आते हैं, कहाँ हुजूर की लज्जत, कहाँ हिजाब दलील। अंधेरी शब है जुदा अपने काफिले से है तू, तेरे लिए है मेरा शोले नवा क़िंदील।
Welcome to Medieval India. Episode 26, The Deccan Ulcer. The political situation in the Deccan in the 1780s can be summed up as follows. The sultans of Bijapur and Golcunda could not for a moment forget that the aim of the Mughal emperor all along was their extinction and the annexation of all their territories. Shaji Bhonsle, Shivaji and Shambaji had so far been their shields in that hour of supreme peril. It would have been sound policy for Aurangzeb to have combined with the kings of Bijapur and Golcunda to put down Shambaji and so bring tranquility back to the Deccan. But Aurangzeb realized those monarchs feared him more than they did the Marathas and would merely nominally ever unite with him, so that Shambaji would never want a safe retreat while they had any dominions left in which to harbour him. Indeed, the acquisition of the kingdoms of Bijapur and Golcunda had been Aurangzeb's prime, constantly frustrated ambition ever since he was a young man, as we saw in an earlier episode. He judged the subjugation of Shambaji as only part of this other and to him far more important enterprise. A union between the Mughal, Bijapur and Golcunda Muslim powers against the Marathas was simply never in the cards after all that had passed between them. Aurangzeb's determination to make an end to the Shia and Maratha powers of the Deccan was further strengthened by the acute danger to his throne with the presence of his rebel son Akbar at Shambaji's court. As we saw before, the emperor accordingly moved south with his great army and his splendid camp equipage, so as to consecutively reduce Golcunda, Bijapur and Satara, the Maratha capital. It would take conceivably 5 years at most, after which the emperor could triumphantly return to Delhi, while the imperial proconsuls in the new provinces would install a new revenue administration, stamp out rebellions, adopt important local chiefs into the Mansabdar rank, and bribe some particularly annoying chiefs by allowing them to raise officially non-condoned cesses from the imperial lands, Chaud and Deshmukhi. That had always been the pattern so far. Even in Bengal, a province that had a stronger tradition of provincial autonomy than the Deccan had. But this time it was not to be. Instead, Aurangzeb would spend the last 26 years of his life in the field, while the Deccan ulcer gradually ate away his and his empire's power. It was all very similar to how the Spanish ulcer consumed Napoleon's empire, and for the same reason. The empire was in both cases operating beyond its logistic limits. Overly long supply lines meant that almost all supplies and reinforcements frittered away before they even reached the army, whereas in both cases they were fighting a dispersed enemy against whom they could not deploy their overwhelmingly more powerful army. Precisely since their opponent had to avoid the might of their much more numerous adversary. Aurangzeb reached Aurangabad on the 22nd March 1682, and Muazzam and Azam were sent against the Marathas in Bijapur at the end of 1683. The next 2 years are a tale of military failure, the escape of Akbar to Persia, and of heavy losses due to the unhealthiness of the climate of the Konkan to the Mughals. The Mughals ravaged Bicholim, immediately to the north of Goa, and unsuccessfully tried to capture Goa itself. Foolishly, since the Portuguese were the main supplier of the imperial forces, and when they stopped with that, the Mughals had immediately to withdraw. But the few successes were offset by the Marathas sacking Bharuch and Berhampur. But the Mughals achieved much better results in other quarters. The Marathas were defeated on several occasions, and much of their territory was occupied. Many Maratha captains joined the Mughals, and 2 wives and 1 daughter of Shambaji were captured and confined in the fortress of Bahadurgarh. Finding it impossible to set right the bankruptcy, chronic anarchy and other troubles in the kingdom, the regent of Bijapur, Massoud, had left the court in disgust in November 1683 and sent his formal resignation from his fort at Adoni early in 1684. Akakush Rao, who stepped into his position as regent, died in October of the same year. Surrounded by dangers from within and from without, especially of Mughal aggression, Sikandar Adil Shah took vigorous steps for the defense of Bijapur and entrusted his most important task to his bravest general and new prime minister, Shah Jahan. Aurangzeb, who had been bent upon annexing this decadent state for a long while, wrote to Adil Shah, summoning him, quote, as a subject to supply provisions to the imperial army promptly, allow the Mughal troops a free passage through his territory, supply a contingent of 5,000 or 6,000 cavalry for the emperor's war with the Marathas, abstain from helping or harboring Shambaji, and expel Shah Jahan from the country." End quote. Sikandar Adil Shah sent a spirited reply to the emperor, and acrimonious letters passed between them for some time. The interval was utilized by both to prepare for the ensuing conflict. On the request of Adil Shah, Abdul Hassan, the Sultan of Golcunda, promised to help Bijapur, and a contingent from Shambaji reached it on 21 February 1685. The Mughal siege of Bijapur fort commenced on 1 April 1685, and Prince Azam arrived with a large army on 14 June to take charge of the operations. The Bijapuri army valorously defended the capital. In this distress of Adil Shah, aid came to him from the Sultan of Golcunda, from Shambaji for the second time, and ex-minister Massoud, who had established himself as a semi-independent ruler at Adorn. While Prince Azam's trenches approached the fort, within a month he had to wage 3 battles with the reinforcements. But the works proceeded slowly, as the ground was dry and hard. For paucity of provisions, a famine broke out in the camp, but Azam still pursued the siege. Even after 15 months, though, the fortress could not be captured, and discord and jealousy among the officers hampered the further progress of the operations. Aurangzeb realized he had absolutely to go there himself and oversee the operation, and the emperor accordingly pitched his camp at the suburb Rasalpur, west of Bijapur, on 3 July 1686. Aurangzeb himself worked hard with his men in the trenches to infuse them with new courage. The garrison of Bijapur, meanwhile, was running out of provisions, and as there was no prospect of any more succour from any quarter, they despaired of holding out for much longer, while the number of defenders had shrunk to 2,000 men only. Sultan Sikandar, on 12 September 1686, therefore went to the emperor in his camp at Rasalpur, where he was well received. After being at first lodged in the state prison at Daulatabad, and then carried about with Aurangzeb's camp, Sikandar died outside Satara Fortress on 1 April 1700, not yet 32 years of age. Aurangzeb entered the empty city on 19 September and erased the frescoes and Shia inscriptions on the wall of the palace, and he demolished the relic shrine Asr-i-Sharif. The kingdom was ordered to be styled Dar as-Zafar now. Complete desolation settled upon the city of Bijapur. From a proud capital and bustling market, it became merely the headquarters of one of the numerous provinces of the Mughal Empire. Its multitudes of artisans and laborers, beggars, poets and scholars, with the court lost their lives. 2 years after its conquest, a terrible bubonic plague swept away more than half its population, and even the abundant water supply in the city wells soon grew scant. The city and its once populous suburbs were deserted and fell into ruins. Clan Duff would describe it 1 century later, quote, "The walls, which are of hewn stone and very lofty, are to this day entire, and being surmounted by the cupolas and minarets of public buildings, still present to the spectator, from without, the appearance of a flourishing city, but within all its solitude, silence and desolation. The deep moat, the double rampart, and the ruins of the splendid palaces in the citadel attest to the former magnificence of the court. The great mosque is a grand edifice, and the tomb of Ibrahim Adil Shah is remarkable for its elegant and graceful architecture. But the chief feature in the scene is the mausoleum of Muhammad Adil Shah, the dome of which fills the eye from every point of view. And though it is entirely devoid of ornaments itself, its enormous dimensions and austere simplicity invest it with an air of melancholy grandeur which harmonizes with the wreck and desolation that surround it." End quote. Some listeners may note that there is something of a poetic justice in this view of a city that had once brought similar devastation on glorious Vijayanagar. The kingdom became a Mughal Subah, and the Adil Shahi officers were enlisted as Mansabdars in the Mughal service, causing a serious overcrowding in the ranks of the Mansabdars. Having disposed of Bijapur, Aurangzeb was not at all willing to allow Golcunda to remain independent, however submissive to him it might be. On the fall of Bijapur, 12 September 1686, he was free to resume his operations against it, and on 28 January 1687 he reached the vicinity of Golcunda. After occupying Hyderabad, the Mughal army laid regular siege to the fort at Golcunda, 7 February 1687, in which the Sultan had taken refuge. Encamped northwest of the fort, the emperor personally supervised the operations. But the emperor's armies were paralyzed, though only temporarily, by rivalries within the imperial camp. Prince Shah Alam wanted to save Abdul Hassan Qutb Shah from humiliation and deprive his brother Azam of the credit of capturing Golcunda, and this led him to engage in secret negotiations with Qutb Shah's agents. The matter, however, leaked out, and the irate father imprisoned his son with his family, and he confiscated his property. Another cause of discord in the imperial camp was that the many Shias in the imperial service heartily disliked the prospect of the extinction of the last Shia kingdom in India, and even many Orthodox Sunnis, like the chief Qadi Shaykh Abdullah, condemned the attack on Bijapur and Golcunda as wars between Muslims and therefore sinful. Firuz Jang, a Turk and a Sunni, was at first the leading officer at the siege, and therefore Shah Sikan Khan, the chief of artillery and the Persian Shia, after working strenuously for some time, resigned in order to spite Firuz Jang. The next two chiefs of artillery were utter failures, and then this post, the most important one in a siege as it might be, was vacant till at last Shah Sikan Khan was reinstated. But by that time the field works had been demolished by the enemy. Says the chronicle, quote, "The siege was protracted for a long time, and from the immense stores of ammunition in the fortress, an unremitting discharge was kept up night and day from the gates and towers and walls of cannon balls, bullets, rockets, and other fiery missiles. The smoke arising from the constant firing removed the distinction of day and night, and no day passed without the besiegers suffering killed and wounded. The assailants asserted themselves vigorously, especially so in the course of a month, and some days the lines were carried up to the very edge of the ditch, and orders were issued for following it up. It is said that Aurangzeb himself, after observing the rite of purification, sewed the seams of the first cotton bag to be filled with earth and thrown into the moat. High mounds were raised, and heavy guns were placed upon them and pointed against the fortress." End quote. At midnight, 26 May, Firuz Jang made an attempt to surprise the fort by scaling the walls with ladders. But the carrion dog of the fort, on seeing strangers, set up a loud bark, which alarmed the garrison, and the Mughal party had to return without success. The Mughal army now fell into the grip of famine, as the enemy infested all the roads and effectually stopped the transport of provisions. In June, the rains descended in torrents, turning the roads into quagmires and the camp into a lake, and completely washed out the trenches and the raised batteries. On the night of 15 June, amid the deluge, the enemy raided the Mughal advanced batteries and trenches, slew the careless gunners, damaged the guns, destroyed the materials and munitions, and carried off the chief of the artillery. It was only after 3 days of struggle that the Mughals were able to reoccupy the lost battery. Meantime, 3 mines had been laid under the bastion of the fort. On 30 June, under the emperor's own eyes, the first of them was fired, but the force of the explosion was directed outwards, and the scattered rock killed 1,100 of the densely crowded assault troopers. After this, the garrison made a sortie, seized the Mughal trenches and outposts, and they were driven off only after bitter man-to-man fighting. Then the second mine was fired with the same disastrous results, and the Mughals lost another 1,000 men, field works and outposts. The Mughals fought desperately to recover them, Firuz Jang and 2 other generals being wounded and large numbers of their men slain. Aurangzeb himself now went into the field to inspire his troops. Cannon balls fell near him, but he coolly kept his position as the soldiers were cheering him. Whilst the melee was raging, a tempest burst on the plain with all the tropical fury of wind, rain and thunder. The rising water forced the Mughals back, and then the enemy made another charge, seizing the trenches further off and carrying away or damaging all their guns. Next morning, the third mine was fired, but having been discovered and flooded with water by the enemy, it did not explode. The siege dragged on. The morale of the imperial army was utterly gone. The famine grew worse than before, and a pestilence broke out too, which nearly depopulated Hyderabad and caused havoc in the camp. Says the chronicle, "At night heaps of dead bodies used to accumulate. After some months, when the rain ceased, the white piles of skeletons looked from a distance like hillocks of snow." End quote. But Aurangzeb held on with grim tenacity and called up reinforcements. Golcunda was completely enclosed by him with a wall of wood and earth, and ingress and egress from the fort stopped. At the same time, he annexed the Qutb Shahi kingdom by proclamation and set up his own officers in all places in it, so as to stop supplies and succor from coming to the fort. The Mughals now had to resort to bribery. An Afghan officer opened the gate on 21 September 1687. Abu Hassan, the last of the Qutb Shahs, left his throne with calmness and dignity. When Ruhollah Khan entered his palace to seize him, he bade his captors to breakfast with him, consoled his women and servants, and left for the Mughal camp. In the evening he was presented by Azam to the emperor, who read him a long lecture on, quote, his corrupt government, wherein he had been very unfaithful in the charge he had committed to him, in encouraging the Brahmins and discouraging the Muslims, to the dishonor of the religion and country, whereby he had justly brought these troubles upon himself. End quote. He was sent off to the prison fortress of Daulatabad with an allowance of 50,000 rupees a year. The booty acquired by the emperor at Golcunda amounted to about 7 million rupees in cash, besides other valuables like gold, silver and jewels, and the state was annexed to the Mughal Empire. Says the correspondence of Aurangzeb, Rogat-i-Alam-Kiri. After the conquest of Bijapur and Hyderabad, the Prime Minister petitioned the Emperor, quote, "Praised be God, that through the grace of thy great omnipotent and the never-to-decay fortune, 2 great kingdoms have been conquered. It is now good policy that the imperial standards should return to paradise-like Hindustan, so that the world may know that nothing more remains for the emperor to do here. But the emperor wrote across the letter, quote, I wonder how an all-knowing hereditary servant like you could make such a request. If your wish is that men might know that no work now remains to be done, it would be contrary to truth. So long as a single breath of this mortal life, Aurangzeb, remains, there is no release from labor and work. Verses. The traveler in the path of long hopes needs no guide. So long as a breath remains, the path of life is not smooth. It is hard that my runaway heart longs for home. The dew has passed away, and yet it still remembers the garden. And Aurangzeb pursued, Praised be God that in whatever place and abode I have been, I have by passing through it withdrawn my heart from all things connected with it, and made death easy for myself. Verse. Untie little by little the knot, tying your heart to earthly things, or else death will snatch away this string all at once and unawares. End quote. Meanwhile, Shambaji and his chief advisor Kalusha, a Brahmin from northern India, had after their failed attempt to help Bijapur become distracted. In April 1683, Shambaji began an invasion of Portuguese territory and advanced with 7,000 cavalry and 15,000 infantry on Goa. He captured the island of São Estevão, 2 miles northeast of Goa, 14 November, inflicted heavy losses on the relief force under the command of the Viceroy, the Count of Alfol, in person. The Maratha forces also captured Sultanates immediately to the south of Goa and the peninsula of Bardesh, north of Goa. But they became trapped into the small island of Kumbarju, immediately to the east of Goa. And as soon as the tide set in, the Portuguese flotilla occupied the 2 wide streams enclosing the island. And from the remaining side there was a heavy bombardment from the fort of Goa. Only a few of the 7,000 Maratha troops escaped alive. Shambaji was glad to hastily make peace with the Portuguese by the mutual restitution of conquests. Shambaji was personally brave, but both he and his minister preferred partying to campaigning, a conduct which alienated him from many of the old Maratha Deshmukhs, grizzled warriors from the times of Shivaji. The chiefs exerted themselves individually against the Mughals, notwithstanding the inefficiency of their Raja. But in spite of their resistance, the open country belonging to the Marathas was gradually overrun by the Mughals, and Aurangzeb was preparing to attack their forts one by one, when a lucky strike by one of his officers unexpectedly threw his principal enemy into his hand. In January 1689, Muharrab Khan, who had deserted from Golcunda during the siege and been named provincial commander of Kolhapur by Aurangzeb, located Shambaji at Sankeshwar, and his spies reported he could be caught off guard. Shambaji was enjoying himself there with a small party of attendants in his favorite brothel. Though Kolhapur is only 60 miles from Sankeshwar, it is separated by the range of the Ghats, and as Muharrab Khan was only a governor of a district, his relative vicinity did not bother Shambaji. Muharrab Khan started at once with a flying column through the hills and forests of the Western Ghats, and with 300 troopers covered the 90 miles from Kolhapur in under 3 days. he reached Sankeshwar before his arrival was noted. Shambaji might still have escaped, for before his house was surrounded, some of his followers ran in with information of the coming of the Mughals. But Shambaji was drunk and only threatened them with punishment for disturbing him. Then Muharrab Khan dashed in, Shambaji's attendants fled, and Kalusha was wounded in a fight to save his master. Both were made prisoners, and they were sent in triumph to the imperial headquarters. They were led through his camp on camels, amidst the din of drums and other noisy instruments, and surrounded by an innumerable multitude who flocked to gasp at their most renowned adversary. And after being exhibited before Aurangzeb, they were ordered into confinement. Aurangzeb probably intended to spare his prisoner, for a time at least, as he might be an indispensable hostage for gaining possession of the Maratha fortresses. But Shambaji, roused to ire by his humiliating reception, and probably remembering the fate of Dara Shukro and Murad, who were murdered whatever they had to say for themselves, when Aurangzeb again summoned him, courted death when he replied to his summon to convert to Islam, with language insulting to the emperor and so impious towards his holy prophet, that he ordered his immediate execution. The sentence was probably issued on the ground of blasphemy, for it was executed with great cruelty, and it was very unlike Aurangzeb's normal uses, who vaunted himself as the great lawgiver. His eyes were first destroyed with the hot iron, his tongue was cut off, and he was at last beheaded along with his favorite Kalusha. Though their persons had been despised by many Marathas, their fate was pitied and resented by all, and it raised wide indignation. But strong as was the animosity of the Marathas, their chance for successful resistance appeared slim. The overwhelming forces of Aurangzeb, his personal reputation, even the pomp and grandeur which surrounded him, and the very name of the great Mughal himself, struck them with an awe they had not experienced when they fought mere lieutenants of his. Their weakness became more conspicuous when Aurangzeb, remaining himself near Pune, sent a force to lay siege to the capital at Rajkar. The principal chiefs had assembled there on the death of Shambaji and had acknowledged their attachment to his infant son, afterwards called Shahu, as Raja, and had nominated his uncle, Raja Ram, as regent. They then, after providing the fortress with garrisons and provisions to be ready for any service that might arise, rode out to save Ginjee in the far south. Rajkar held out for several months until a secret ascent was disclosed to the Mughals by Mawali chief. Just as had happened with Alauddin 300 years before, as the power of the Mughal seemed to have culminated, all seemed won. But in reality all was now lost. The empire had become too large to be ruled by one man or from one center. His enemies rose on all sides. And like Alauddin, he could defeat some of them all of the time, but not cross all of them all of the time. Lawlessness reigned in many parts of northern and central India. The administration grew slack and corrupt. The war in the Deccan so depleted the imperial treasury that for the last 10 years of Aurangzeb's reign, the pay of his troops was usually 3 years in arrear. And Manucci thus described the devastation caused by this quarter century of futile warfare and the complete desolation of the Deccan, quote, Aurangzeb withdrew to Ahmednagar, leaving behind him the fields of these provinces devoid of trees and bare of crops, their place being taken by the bones of men and beasts. Instead of verdure, all is now black and barren. There have died in his armies over 100,000 souls yearly, and of animals, pack oxen, camels, elephants, etc., over 300,000. In the Deccan provinces from 1702 to 1704, plague and famine prevailed. In these 2 years there expired over 2 million souls. End quote. With Shahu in the hands of the enemy, it was decided the regents of the Marathas should withdraw to Ginjee in the Karnataka, while his fortresses in the Deccan were to be put in good state of defense and his troops dispersed in their villages, ready to profit by better times. Ram Raja accordingly proceeded with a few followers in disguise through the hostile provinces between him and Ginjee. When he reached that place, he proclaimed his arrival and assumed the title of Raja, on the ground of the captivity of his nephew, Shahu. He was fortunate to have picked as his advisor Prahlad, one of the Brahmin ministers who had the talent to prevail over the other ministers and chiefs, and enough judgment to see that it was not desirable, even if it had been practicable, to do more than give some direction to the common but necessarily dispersed effort of the Marathas. Without the genius of Shivaji, the Marathas would never have been united. But now the situation required everyone to operate for themselves. The plan was to bend before a blow, offer nothing for the enemy to attack, and to return to the charge wherever and whenever it suited the Marathas to take the part of the assailant. To use a modern comparison, the tactics the Viet Cong used during the Vietnam War. Accordingly, their chiefs, who were in possession of lands, lost no time in making their submission to the Mughal, and none were quicker and louder in professions of zeal and attachment than they. But they almost all kept in communication with the rebels, allowed their retainers to join them, even sent parties secretly under their own relations to share in plundering expeditions. And they did more mischief as spies and hollow confederates than they could have done as open enemies. The Marathas were no longer merely local rebels, but the one dominating factor of Deccan politics, and an enemy all-pervasive throughout the Indian peninsula. Elusive as the wind, and the allies and the rallying point of all the enemies of the Delhi Empire, and all the disturbers of public peace and of regular administration throughout, in the Deccan, and even in Malwa, Gondwana and Bundelkhand. The Mughals could not be present everywhere in full strength. Hence they suffered reverses in places, and every such blow strengthened the courage of their opponents. Zulfikar Khan, as the supreme Mughal commander, reached the environs of Ginjee around the middle of September 1690 with the object of besieging the fort. But the task was too great for his means. The rock fortress of Ginjee consists of 3 fortified hillocks connected together by strong walls and forming a rough triangle nearly 3 miles in circumference. These hills are steep, rocky, and covered with such enormous boulders that they are almost unclimbable. Zulfikar could neither bombard it nor cut off the garrison's communication with the outside. The activity of the Maratha roving bands stopped this grain supply. He abandoned the siege, and at his request reinforcements under the Vizier Azad Khan and the young Prince Khan Baksh reached him at the end of December 1691. He renewed the siege in 1692, ran trenches and bombarded 2 points without doing any damage. His object was only to make a show, prolong the siege, and thereby escape from being sent on campaign elsewhere. The Maratha light horse dominated the open country and blocked the flow of provisions and letters to the Mughal camp, which lived in a state of siege. Rumors spread there Aurangzeb was dead and that Shah Alam had mounted the throne. Khan Baksh, in fear of the holocaust of family members which followed a Mughal succession, corresponded in secret with Raja Ram to escape to Ginjee with his family and then to attempt to seize the throne at Delhi with Maratha aid. This plot was betrayed to Zulfikar and Azad Khan. They consulted the leading officers, who urged that the safety of the army required that the prince should be kept under guard, the trenches abandoned, and all the troops concentrated in the rear lines after spiking the immutable siege guns. The retreat was effected only after a severe fight with the surrounding enemy and heavy losses. The prince, who had conspired to arrest the two generals, was himself now detained in Azad Khan's tent and sent back to his father under escort. In February 1694, Zulfikar Khan set out southwards along the coast, conquering many forts in the South Arcot district and threatening Tanjore, the Raja of which, Shambaji II, had to sign a treaty on 1 June, promising to obey the emperor, give up Raja Ram's cause, and pay an annual tribute of 3 million rupees. Early in 1697, he collected tribute from Tanjore and other places in the south, and then returned to Vandivaj for the rainy season. The fight between the two Maratha generals Santa and Dana had meanwhile weakened the Marathas, and Zulfikar now renewed the siege of Ginjee. Daud Khan Pani, his lieutenant, captured Shikaladurg, the detached southern fort of Ginjee, by assault in 1 day and then entrenched opposite the south face of Ginjee itself. But his further efforts were thwarted by Zulfikar, who gave the Marathas secret intelligence of his intended attacks. At last, Zulfikar had to take Ginjee in order to save his credit with the emperor. But he sent a timely warning to Raja Ram, who escaped to Vellore with his chief officers but left his family behind. The 3 forts within Ginjee were gallantly stormed by the Rajput and Afghans on 18 January 1698. A vast amount of booty was captured, and among the prisoners were 4 wives and 5 children of Raja Ram. But when Raja Ram himself reached Visalkar, the whole intention of the long siege of Ginjee was undone. No sooner was Raja Ram settled in Ginjee than he renewed the war in Maharashtra himself by dispatching his 2 most active chiefs, Santa Korpade and Dhanasri Jadoo, to make a diversion there. Before they arrived, some leaders of the discharged Bijapur troops had begun to plunder on their own account, and as soon as these well-known leaders made their appearance, Maratha horsemen issued from every village and flocked to join their standards. Ram Chandra Pant, who was left at Satara, in the civil charge of what little territory remained to the Marathas, had assembled some troops within his own district, and he now called a new and more efficient army into existence. His plan was to confer on every man of influence among the soldiery a right to levy the chout and other claims of the Maratha government on all places not in its possession, and to plunder and lay waste every country that refused this tribute. The contributions were to go to the payment of the troops, the booty to the actual captors, and each chief was authorized to impose, for his personal benefit, a new exaction called corn and hay money. This invitation put every horseman in the country in motion. Most of the principal Maratha names appeared, and many for the first time, as leaders of independent parties of various strength, which set out to enrich themselves at the expense of the Mughal subjects. The leader of the resistance in the west or in the Maratha Desh were the Amitais, Ramchandra Bhavdekar, the Sachivs, Sangaraj Malhar, and Parashuram Trimbak, who became regent in 1701, while in the eastern Karnataka the leader was Prahlad Netaji, created Pratidindi, that is chief commander, who stood above the nominal prime minister or Peshwa. Two extraordinarily able generals, Danaya Dao and Santa Korpade, rivals for the commission of commander-in-chief, passed from one theatre of war to the other across the peninsula, and caused the greatest loss and confusion to the Mughals. Says the Mughal chronicle about Korpade, quote, "Everyone who encountered him was either killed or wounded and made prisoner, or if anyone did escape, it was with his mere life, with the loss of his army and bagage. Nothing could be done, for wherever the accursed dog went and threatened an attack, there was no imperial emir bold enough to resist him, and every loss he inflicted on their forces made the boldest warrior quake." End quote. The first flush of Mughal success was now over, as the Marathas recovered from the blows of Shambaji's capture and Rajaram's flight, and they gained their first signal victory over the Mughals on 4 June 1690, when they captured Shah Khan near Shatara with his family, 4,000 horses, and the entire camp and bagage of his army. Then they recovered several forts from the Mughals, such as Panhala. The siege of this fort, urged by Aurangzeb, failed after many years of desultory attacks on the Muiz-ud-Din, Bijapur, and Firuzjan. The disaster to Shah Khan in 1690 compelled the emperor to occupy the North Satara district in force, which led to frequent but indecisive conflicts with Santa Korpade, who had made the Mahadev Hills his base, and who raided from there in all compass directions. Late in 1693 they returned home and renewed their attacks. Darna destroyed the siege works before Panhala. Throughout 1694 and 1695 the Maratha bands were active, but nothing decisive or noteworthy was done on either side, except for a lot of desultory fighting and futile marches, which wore the Mughals even more down than the Marathas, however. Then came two terrible blows to them. In November 1695, the emperor, learning that Santa Korpade was conveying a rich store of plunder to his own home in northwestern Mysore, ordered Qasim Khan to intercept him. The two divisions united near Chitaldurg, and Qasim Khan entertained his noble guest with all the pomp and luxury of a Mughal grandee, discarding military precaution. Santa came up from a distance by swift and secret marches, and formed his men in 3 divisions, which were very ably handled and coordinated. The first surprised and plundered the advanced tents of Qasim Khan and his heavy bagage. The second intercept and enveloped the Khan, who was advancing to the rescue, while the third Maratha division looted the camp and bagage left by Qasim Khan in his advance. The Carnatic musketeers and Maratha light horse completely overpowered the Mughals and drove them in headlong rout to the small force of Dodari, which had neither space nor food sufficient for them. Fully 1/3 of the Mughal army fell in the battle and retreat. The rest capitulated through hunger. Qasim Khan committed suicide. The remnant of his army, after promising a ransom of 2 million rupees and giving up all its cash, horses and other property, was set free. Another great Mughal general, Himmat Khan, was in Basavapatan, 40 miles west of Dodari. Santa appeared before it on 30 January 1696 and lured Himmat Khan out of his refuge and shot him dead as he was leading a charge. His bagage was plundered and his men fell back into the fort. Here they were relieved after more than a month. But now a civil war weakened the Maratha strength. Santa Korpede was bitterly jealous of Dana Jadau, his favorite rival for the post of commander-in-chief, Senapati. He was a good soldier, but says the chronicle about him, quote, "He was very severe in the punishments he inflicted on his followers. For a trifle offence, he would cast a man under the feet of an elephant," end quote. So that many other Maratha grandees resented him. Santa was attacked by Raja Ram and Dana near Kanchipuram, but he defeated them. When he returned to Maharashtra in March 1697, a civil war broke out between him and Dana, all the Maratha captains being ranged on the two sides. In another battle, most of Santa's followers, disgusted with his severity, went over to Dana. Santa, defeated and despoiled of all, fled from the field, but near the Mahadev hills he was murdered by order of Radhika Bai Mane, whose brother he had slain. Nothing remarkable happened in the second half of 1697, not for some time after Raja Ram's return from Ginjee to Vishalkar in Maharashtra. Next year, after forming plans for an extensive raid through Khandesh and Berar, he issued from Satara, 5 November 1699, and took the road with a large force. But he was intercepted near Parendra by Bedar Bakht, broken and driven towards Ahmednagar. On 12 March 1700, Raja Ram died at Singar. His senior widow, Tara Bhai, placed her son Shivaji III on the throne, while another wife, Rajas Bai, crowned her son as Shambaji II, and the Maratha ministers and generals were again divided into two rival factions. But Tarabai's ability and energy, seconded by the genius of Parashuram Trimbak, the new regent, finally gave her supreme power in the state. Meanwhile, in the Mughal camp, on the news of Raja Ram's death, says the chronicle, on receiving this intelligence, the emperor ordered the drums of rejoicing to be beaten, and the soldiers congratulated each other, saying that another prime mover in this strife was now removed, and that it would not be difficult to overcome two young children and a helpless woman. They thought their enemy weak, contemptible, and helpless. But Tarabai, as the wife of Raja Ram was called, showed great powers of command and government, and from day to day the war spread and the power of the Marathas increased. End quote. By April 1695, Aurangzeb had come to realize that far from being able to return triumphantly to Delhi, his work in the Deccan was not finished with the conquest of Bijapur, Golcunda and the Maratha capital by far. Not only that, it was merely beginning, as dozens of strongholds still had to be reduced. Therefore, in May 1695, he sent his eldest surviving son, Shah Alam, to govern the Punjab, Sindh and afterwards Afghanistan, and guard the northwestern gateway of India, while he himself took post at Brahmapuri for the next 4.5 years in the very heart of the enemy country. During the period from 1695 to 1699, the Maratha danger came ever nearer and drove the Mughals into the defensive in Maharashtra and Kannada. For carrying few supplies and living largely off the land, the movements of their roving bands were bewilderingly rapid and unexpected, and the Mughal pursuing columns, weighed down by their cumbersome bagage, chased them in vain. Local representatives of the emperor were often driven to make unauthorized terms with the Marathas by agreeing to pay chout, and worse than that, some imperialists made a concert with the enemy for sharing the plunder of the emperor's own subjects. The Mughal administration was dissolving, and only the presence of the emperor held it together, but merely as a phantom of its own self. The fall of Ginjee enabled Aurangzeb to concentrate all his resources in the western theatre of war. And now began the successive systematic besieging of the Maratha forts by the emperor in person. A hill fort captured by him in person after a vast expenditure of time, men and money, was then often recovered by the Marathas from the weak Mughal garrison after a few months, and the siege had then to begin a year or two later all over again. The soldiers and camp followers, meanwhile, suffered terrible hardships while they were being cajoled across flooded rivers, muddy roads, and broken hill tracks. Porters disappeared, transport beasts died of hunger and overwork, scarcity of grain was ever present in the camps, and the Maratha thieves, as Aurangzeb called them, were never far off. The mutual jealousies of his generals ruined his cause or delayed his successes. The siege of only 8 forts, Satara, Parli, Panhala, Kelna, Kundana, Rajkar, Torna and Wagingera, besides 5 places of lesser note, occupied Aurangzeb for 5 years and a half. Camilli Guerrieri, an Italian doctor, who visited imperial headquarters in 1695, gives an account of the great camp at Kalgala. That tide of demoralization that eventually allowed the British to easily defeat far larger Mughal armies had started, though Aurangzeb still seemed Lord Paramount of northern India and the Deccan, and of the south as far south as Tanjavur. The camp was 30 miles in circumference and held about 500,000 people. The army properly, consisting of 60,000 cavalry, 100,000 infantry, 3,000 elephants and 50,000 camels and 250 bazaars where they ideally could buy their supplies, every general having one to serve his own men, according to Carreri. That huge population ate up all provisions for miles around, and whenever the lines of communications with the north were cut by the Marathas, Kalgala ran immediate danger of starvation. In the 90s, the imperial army reportedly ate up 100,000 people every year. Meanwhile, the emperor's simple way of living was not followed by his officers. Luxury, effeminacy and corruption were the norm. And Carreri further noted, quote, "These generals command every one in his own troops, without being subordinate to another, only obeying a lieutenant of the king, when he is not there in person, called a Jumdatal Mulk, who receives the king's orders to communicate them to the generals. Hence it is that they, being lazy and undisciplined, call upon service when they please, and when there is no great danger. Many Frenchmen belonging to the army told me it was a pleasure and diversion to serve the Mughal, because They will not fight or do not keep their cars and are subject to no other penalty but losing their payday, that they are convinced of having transgressed, and that they themselves did not value honor much in the service of a barbarous king who has no hospital for the wounded man. Says Sheikh Sadi, quote, "One of the ancient kings neglected the government of his realm and kept the army in distress. Accordingly, the whole of it ran away when a powerful enemy appeared. Verse. If he refrains from giving treasure to the troops, they refrain from putting their hands to the sword. What bravery will they display in battle array when their hands are empty and affairs deplorable? The Mughal troops would capture a position one day only to lose it the next, while famine, pestilence and flood weakened the ranks of a demoralized army." As an eyewitness, Bhimsen wrote, quote, "The Marathas became completely dominant over the whole kingdom and closed the roads. By means of robbery they escaped from poverty and rose to great wealth. I have heard that every week they distributed alms and sweetmeats in charity, praying for the long life of the emperor who had provided for them, the feeder of the universe. The price of grain grew higher and higher, and in the imperial camp in particular, vast numbers perished of hunger, and many kinds of illegal exactions and practices appeared." And Bhimsen added, quote, "When the Marathas invade a province, they take from every pargana as much money as they desire, and make their horses eat the standing crops or tread them down. The imperial army that comes in pursuit can subsist there only after they have been cultivated anew. All administration has disappeared. The peasants have given up cultivating. The jagirdars do not get a penny from their fiefs, and the servants of the Maratha state support themselves by plundering on all sides and pay a small part of their booty to their king, getting no salary from him. The coming of rent from the Mughal officers' jagirs has ceased. The condition of the imperial army grew worse from the high price of grain and the devastation of the jagirs, while the resources of the Marathas increased through robbery. Thus a vicious cycle was formed which aggravated the evil. The Mansabdars, on account of the scanty forces under them, cannot gain control over their jagirs. The local zamindars, growing stronger, have joined the Marathas, raised troops, and stretched the hand of oppression over the realm. As the imperial dominions have been giving out in fiefs to the jagirdars, so too the Marathas have made a distribution of the whole empire among their generals, and thus one kingdom has to support two sets of jagirdars now. The peasants, subjected to this double exaction, have collected arms and horses, and they joined the Marathas." End quote. The emperor's long stay in the Deccan, for a quarter of a century, with the best of his officers, and his prolonged wars there, with the consequent drain of wealth and manpower, meant that the administration of provinces in northern India was left in charge of second-rate figures with limited resources and insufficient troops, and many of them hopelessly corrupt, while taxes became ever more oppressive. All this ushered in disastrous consequences for the empire in its base of revenue in the north that was drained from resources to feed the war in the Deccan. Centrifugal forces were let loose by the emperor's long absence from the capital and the lack of a sufficiently strong will at the center of the empire. The great royal roads leading from Delhi to Agra and Dolpur and then through Malwa to the Deccan passed directly through the country of the Jats. In 1685 these people raised their heads under two new leaders, Raja Ram and Ram Chacha. The petty chiefs of Sinsani and Sogor, who were the first to train their clansmen in group organization and open warfare. Every Jat peasant was practiced in wielding the sword. They had only to be embodied in regiments, taught to obey their captains, and supplied with firearms to make them into an army. As basis for their operations, refuges for their chiefs in defeat, and storing places for their booty, they built several small fortresses amidst their trackless jungles and strengthened them with mud walls that could defy artillery. They then began to raid the king's highways and carried their depredations to the very gates of Agra. Raja Ram gained some striking victories. He killed near Dolpur the renowned Durrani warrior Uyghur Khan when on his way from Kabul to the Deccan, and next year plundered Mir Ibrahim, a former Qutb Shahi general now created to Mahabad Khan, who was marching to join his viceroyalty in the Punjab. Shortly afterwards, he looted Akbar's tomb at Gandhara, doing great damage to the building and, according to one account, digging out and burning that great emperor's bones. This sudden development of the Jat power alarmed Aurangzeb, and he sent his favorite grandson, Bijapur, to assume the supreme command in the Jat war in 1688. Bishan Singh Kachawa, the new Raja of Jaipur, was appointed as commander of Mutra with a special charge to root out the Jats. Bijapur infused greater vigor into the Mughal operation. In an internecine war raging between two Rajput clans, Raja Ram, who was fighting for one party, was shot dead. Bijapur laid siege to Sinsani. His troops underwent great hardship from the scarcity of provisions and water. At last they fired a mine, stormed the breach, and captured the fort after 3 hours of obstinate fighting, the Mughals losing 900 men and the Jats 1,500. As a result of these operations, the Jat leaders went into hiding and the district enjoyed peace for some years. The next rising of the clan was under Guraman, a nephew of Raja Ram. He had a genius for organization and using opportunities, and succeeded in founding a dynasty at Bharatpur. He not only increased the numbers of his soldiers, but also strengthened them by the addition of fusiliers, musketeers, and a troop of cavalry. And having robbed many of the ministers of the Mughal court on the road, he attacked the royal wardrobe and the revenue sent from the provinces, thus a French account. After Aurangzeb's departure to the Deccan, the Mughal officers continued to be in possession of the cities and strategic places of Marwar. But the Rathore warrior bands, who still occupied the hills, attacked Mughal outposts, cut off their supply convoys, and rendered communication and cultivation there almost impossible. This struggle was carried on under different leaders, as Ajit Singh was a minor and Durga Das was absent in the Deccan. Durga Das returned from the Deccan in 1687 and then conducted the operations against the Mughal. With the aid of Durkan Salhara of Bundi, the Rathors not only obtained some brilliant successes in Marwar, but also defeated the governor of Ajmer and raided the Mughal territory in Mewat and in the neighborhood of Delhi. But the Mughal governor, Sujat Khan, maintained the imperial hold on most of Marwar by arms as well as by his clever policy of paying the Rathors chaut, or 1/4 of the imperial custom duties on merchandise passing through. The emperor was anxious to bring back Prince Akbar's daughter Safiat Unisa and son Bulan Akhtar, both of whom had been left with the Rathors by their father in 1681. After successful negotiations, she was delivered to her grandfather in 1696, and the emperor was delighted to learn that Durga Das had made necessary arrangements for her education in Islamic theology by appointing a Muslim mistress from Ajmer. In 1698, Bulan Akhtar was also delivered to his grandfather. As a result of all these, Durga Das was appointed a Mansabdar of 3,000 and the commander of Patan in Gujarat, and Maharaja Ajit Singh was made a Mansabdar, but he did not get back his kingdom. The last stage of the struggle with the Marathas, the last stage of the struggle in Marwar, lasted from 1701 to 1707, at the end of which Maharaja Ajit Singh marched in triumph into Jodhpur, the capital of Marwar. Although a reconciliation had been made between the Mughals and the Rathors, as mentioned above, it did not last long. Aurangzeb ordered the governor of Gujarat either to arrest Durga Das or kill him. Alarmed, he rode away to Marwar and joining Ajit Singh again took up arms against the Mughals. But they could not achieve anything to their credit, and there were serious disagreements between Durga Das and his master for the imperious temper and want of tact of the latter. Durga Das then offered his submission to the emperor, who gave him back his rank and post in Gujarat. But in 1706, taking advantage of a Maratha invasion in Gujarat, followed by a serious defeat of the Mughals, Ajit and Durga Das once more raised the standard of rebellion. Unable to cope with his enemies, the latter fled to the Koli country, but Ajit defeated Mukam Singh of Nagaur, who had fought on behalf of the Mughals. Receiving information of Aurangzeb's death in March 1707, Ajit Singh rode with his forces to Jodhpur and, defeating the Mughal army of occupation, took final possession of it. The final effect of the Rajput wars of Aurangzeb was disastrous to the empire. They not only had caused heavy losses of men and money, but the damage to imperial prestige was worse still. At the time it seemed good policy to annex Udaipur and thus stamp out a territory and a ruling house that had been a fulcrum of resistance and revolt against Muslim rule for centuries. But in retrospect it was foolish to provoke the two leading Rajput clans into hostility and thus destroy the carefully balanced rapprochement Akbar had forged between the Mughals and the Rajput ruling houses, and with it lose their devoted and gallant services in the northwestern frontier or in the Deccan, which, as we saw, had almost reduced the Marathas to obedient service too. While the emperor lost his grip on the Rajasthan after 1705, the Marathas became masters of the situation all over the Deccan and even in parts of central India. By that date, his generals were urging Aurangzeb to make with the Marathas immediately a peace, but Aurangzeb merely retorted, "So long as there is still a breath in this old life, labor continues." The Mughal officers were everywhere pushed into the defensive, and Maratha tactics changed with this. They were no longer, as in Shivaji's and Shambaji's time, just light horsemen who fell on defenseless traders and villagers, dispensing at the first report of the Mughal army's approach. On the contrary, they had now become a Mughal-style regular army. As Manucci noted in 1704, quote, "These Maratha leaders and their troops move in these days with much confidence, because they have cowed the Mughal commanders and inspired them with fear. At the present time they possess artillery, musketry, elephants and camels for all their baggage and tents. In short, they are equipped and move about just like the armies of the Mughal." End quote. Even at Ahmednagar, Aurangzeb's camp was threatened by a vast horde of Marathas in May 1706, and it was only after a long and severe contest that they could be repulsed. In Gujarat, a terrible disaster befell the imperialists. Anjumand, a former brewer of Khandesh, who had taken to highway robbery, invited Dana Jadau and his army, and he sacked the large and rich trading center of Baroda, the imperial commander of the place being captured with his men. Similarly, the province of Aurangabad was frequently ravaged by raiding Maratha bands under different leaders. In July, Maratha activity near Vakingera forced the emperor to detach a strong force there. When the rainy season of 1706 ended in September, Maratha activity was renewed with tenfold intensity. Dana Yadav made a dash for Berar and Khandesh, but was headed off by Nusrat Khan into Bijapur and beyond the Krishna. A long train of caravans coming from Aurangabad to the imperial camp in Ahmednagar was plundered of everything on the way. The last years of Aurangzeb's life were inexpressibly sad. On its public side there was the consciousness that his long reign, after half a century, had been a failure. "After me will come the deluge." This was said by Aurangzeb before Louis XIV repeated it word for word. His domestic life too was loveless and dreary, wanting in any benign peace of old age. A sense of unutterable loneliness haunted the heart of the old Aurangzeb. One daughter, Zinat-Unisha, already an old maid, looked after his household, and his youngest concubine, Udaipuri, still held him company. But he had, at one time or other, to imprison all his 5 sons except one. By his own conduct in the War of Succession, he had raised a spectre which relentlessly pursued him. What if his sons should treat him in his weak old age as he had treated old Shah Jahan? This fear ever haunted his mind, and he had no peace while his sons were with him. Lastly, there was the certainty of a deluge of blood when he would close his eyes, and his 3 surviving sons, each supported by a provincial army and treasury, would fight for the throne to the bitter end. In October 1705, Aurangzeb became seriously ill and slowly and with difficulty reached Ahmednagar in the following January, pursued by the Maratha horse. The old man of 90 lingered on for a year, while his second son, Azam, was deeply involved in intrigues to secure the throne and busy plotting against the life of his younger brother, Khan Baksh, Aurangzeb's favorite son. Dr. Kareri describes the emperor when he was nearly 80, quote, Aurangzeb was of low stature, with a large nose, slender and stooping with age. The whiteness of his round beard was more visible on his olive skin. He was clothed in plain white muslin and wore a turban adorned with a large emerald. I admired to see him endorse the petitions with his own hand, without spectacles, and by his cheerful, smiling countenance he seemed to be pleased with his employment. End quote. Aurangzeb had carefully prepared himself for the kingship and charted for himself a course of policy from which he never swerved. He spent his whole life doing what he held to be his duty to serve the good of the empire that Akbar had created, and that treachery and assassination were fully justified in furthering this ideal. For as he said, quote, one cannot rule without practicing deception. The clear text of the holy tradition of Muhammad is, war is stratagem. In the opinion of the common herd, cunning and deception are greatly scorned. But as God himself in his holy word, it is the Quran, has ascribed cunning to his own self, saying, God is the best of plotters. It is contrary to the Quran to consider stratagem as blamable. End quote. His industry in conducting the affairs of state was stupendous. As he said, quote, the eternal journey, which no man can avoid, will have to be undertaken all of a sudden, without previous warning. What shall I do then? This, my present journey, should be considered as like that eternal one. I shall march further on in the same way in which I have arrived up to this place. Nay, it is not even necessary to mark out the stages for the successive day marches. I shall daily travel as far as I can. First, the wayfarer in the path of death is not in need of stages. End quote. In the rigid austerity of his way of living, the emperor allowed himself no relaxation too, and his Muslim subjects regarded him as a saint. The simplicity of his life is illustrated by the instructions he gave for his funeral. He was buried in a coffin, which cost 5 rupees, the proceeds of the sale of caps which he had quilted himself, while the 300 rupees which he ordered to be distributed to the poor had been earned by making copies of the Quran. Aurangzeb possessed a distinctly sardonic humor. The story is told that the emperor, on his way to the mosque one Friday, after he had prohibited the performance of music at the court, met a funeral attended by about 1,000 people. When he asked who was dead, he was told, the king by his order has killed music, and we are bearing her to her grave. Pray for the soul of music, replied Aurangzeb, and see that she is thoroughly well buried, that there will come no sound from below the earth. End quote. On another occasion, the emperor does not figure with equal success. A strict abstainer himself, The use of alcohol by his subjects infuriated him. As Manucci tells the story, quote, Aurangzeb said one day that in all Hindustan no more than 2 men could be found who did not drink, namely himself and Abdul Wahab, the chief Qazi appointed by him. But with respect to Abdul Wahab, he was in error, for I myself sent him every day a bottle of spirits, which he drank in secret, so that the king did not find it out. End quote. Aurangzeb was a widely read and accurate scholar, and to his initiative the country owes its greatest digest of Muslim law, the Fatwa-i-Alam-Kiri. There was but little building during his reign, and the style of Mughal architecture rapidly degenerated after Aurangzeb's accession, while the art of painting, though not discouraged by the emperor, noticeably deteriorated. Few grand edifices, few finely written manuscripts or exquisite pictures commemorate Aurangzeb's reign. Early in February 1707, the emperor realized that he was dying, and he sent Azam and Khan Baksh to their provinces of Bijapur and Malwa. Then, with the fear of future torment in his heart, he prepared for death. Like another Puritan and iconoclast, Cromwell, the once dictator of England, his spirit passed in the midst of a violent storm on the 20th of February 1707. The deathbed letters expressed the weariness of an aged man who had lived too long, had failed in all his cherished plans, and was tormented by fear about his fate in the next world, after what he had done to his father, his sons and brothers, and thus fears perfectly sincere. These are extracts from his last 3 letters, which are nearly identical. Quote, I know not who I am, where I shall go now, or what will happen to this sinner, full of sins. Now I will say goodbye to everyone in this world, and entrust everyone to the care of God. My famous and auspicious sons should not quarrel among themselves, and allow a general massacre of the people who are servants of God. My years have gone by profitless. God has been in my heart, yet my darkened eyes have not recognized his light. There is no hope for me in the future. The fever is gone, but only the skin is left. The army is confused and without heart or help, even as I am, apart from God, with no rest for the heart. When I lost hope in myself, how can I hope in others? You, my sons, should accept this, my last will. It should not happen that Muslims be killed and the blame for their death rest upon this useless creature. I have greatly sinned and know not what torment awaits me. I commit you and your sons to the care of God and bid you farewell. May the peace of God be upon you.